The snow was thick and relentless, turning the world into a blurry, white void. It seemed like the storm would never end, swallowing everything in its path. In the midst of it, a small, shivering puppy lay on the frozen ground, his tiny body nearly hidden beneath the heavy snow. His eyes were wide with fear, his breath shallow and visible in the freezing air. He had been abandoned, left alone to die in a world that seemed indifferent to his suffering. The sounds of the blizzard howled around him, drowning out any hope of rescue. His body trembled uncontrollably, and for a moment, he thought he might be swallowed whole by the snow. Then, through the blur of the storm, a figure appeared, a woman, her face hidden beneath a scarf, her movements steady despite the snow and wind. She knelt beside him, her hands reaching out, trembling but determined. The puppy flinched, his eyes clouded with terror, but there was something in the woman's touch, a softness, a kindness, that made him hesitate. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than words, and in that moment, the puppy felt the faintest spark of hope flicker inside him. She wasn't just a passerby, she was his chance. Show your love, hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The snowstorm came quickly without warning. The sky darkened as heavy clouds rolled in, and the first flakes began to fall, coating the world in a blinding white sheet. The wind picked up, howling across the open field, its icy fingers slapping at the earth, biting at the skin of anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in it. It was the kind of storm that made you want to hide away, to shelter from the world. But for one small creature there was nowhere to go, no place to escape the storm. Beneath the heavy snow, a tiny figure lay shivering, barely noticeable against the white expanse. A German shepherd puppy, its body weak and emaciated, its ribs visible beneath the thin layer of fur, was struggling to breathe. His tiny form was half buried in the snow, the cold seeping deeper into his bones with each passing second. His breath came in shallow gasps fogging in the frigid air, but he made no sound. He could hardly muster the strength to whimper. His body was too weak, and his spirit was nearly extinguished. The world around him seemed far away, muffled by the howling wind and the thick layers of snow. His once vibrant eyes were now wide and glazed, clouded with fear and confusion. He didn't know how long he had been here, abandoned in the storm. His body was exhausted, barely holding on, and his mind was clouded with the fading memories of warmth, of human voices that once cared for him. But now there was nothing but the biting cold, the unrelenting snow, and a deep, aching loneliness that had settled deep within his chest. Every moment felt like an eternity. His legs were too weak to stand, his tiny body too frail to move. He tried to lift his head, but it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. The snow was building around him, burying him inch by inch, as though nature itself had decided he no longer belonged in this world. He had been left behind, abandoned, forgotten. No one was coming for him. There was no one to save him. The wind howled louder, swirling around the puppy's fragile body, pushing the snow higher. It felt as if the world had turned its back on him. In the distance, there was no sound, no movement, just the endless white landscape and the storm's cold fury. His eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open as the snow continued to pile on top of him. He shivered uncontrollably, his body growing weaker by the second. There was no comfort to be found in the frozen expanse, no warmth, no hope. His breath was slowing, each exhale more faint than the last. He could feel his strength fading, his little heart racing against the inevitable. It seemed like he would be swallowed by the snow, his existence reduced to nothing more than a forgotten memory. And then, just as he thought he could no longer endure the weight of the world, he saw something, a movement in the distance. The storm had blurred everything, the snow falling in thick, blinding sheets, but through the haze there was a figure, a shadow emerging from the white fog. At first the puppy didn't know what it was. His vision was clouded, his mind foggy from the cold, but as the figure drew closer he realized it was a person, a human being. Her form was barely visible against the storm's fury, but the puppy's instinct stirred. His body trembled harder now, not just from the cold, but from the realization that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been forgotten after all. The person was moving toward him, their steps steady despite the blizzard's rage. The puppy's wide eyes locked onto the figure, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something inside him shift. A flicker of hope, so faint that it was almost unrecognizable. The woman's face was hidden beneath a scarf, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her breath visible in the cold air. She wasn't just another passerby. She was someone who had come to him, someone who had noticed him, someone who might be able to save him. But the puppy's fear still held him tightly. He couldn't bring himself to move, to lift his head, to hope for anything more than the warmth of the person's presence. He was still terrified, still uncertain of what would happen next. Her steps grew closer, and with each one, the fear within him seemed to double. He wanted to trust her, but how could he? He had been abandoned once already. He didn't know if he could survive that pain again. The woman reached him at last, kneeling down beside his small, trembling form. She didn't rush, didn't act hastily. Her movements were slow, gentle, as if she had all the time in the world. Her hands, shaking from the cold, reached out toward him, and he flinched, instinctively pulling away. But there was no harm in her touch. Her fingers brushed the cold fur on his back, and the softness of her touch made something inside him stir. It wasn't fear. It was something else, a flicker of something long forgotten. The woman whispered to him, her voice soft but filled with resolve. "It's okay," she said, though the puppy didn't understand the words. But it didn't matter. Her voice, calm and steady, seemed to wrap around him like a blanket. It was warmth in the storm. He could feel the tension in his body begin to ease, just a little. And then, as if his body had finally realized that it didn't have to fight anymore, he allowed himself to be lifted. The woman cradled him in her arms, her body's warmth seeping into his cold, trembling form. He didn't move at first, too weak to resist, but as the woman held him close, something inside him shifted. The fear was still there, deep within him, but it was no longer all-consuming. For the first time, the puppy felt the faintest trace of safety, the smallest hint of hope. She was here, and she wasn't leaving. The storm still howled around them, the world still cold and harsh, but in that moment everything else faded. The woman held him tightly, gently, as if he was the most precious thing in the world. And for the puppy, that was enough. For the first time since he had been abandoned, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of rescue, in the warmth of human touch. And for the first time, the storm didn't feel so all-encompassing. There was still hope. The world beyond the shelter of the woman's coat was a blur of white, swirling snow, and unrelenting wind. Yet, within the warmth of the woman's embrace, the puppy slowly began to feel the coldness that had once claimed his body begin to melt away. She cradled him carefully, his small frame trembling, yet his body instinctively seeking her warmth. Every shiver, every breath he took seemed so fragile, like a moment caught in time, uncertain, yet full of hope. The storm outside raged on, but inside her arms he was safe for now. She moved quickly but gently, taking careful steps through the snow, her path leading to the truck parked a little ways down. Her boots sank into the thick snow with each step, but she didn't hesitate. The weight of the puppy in her arms, despite its fragility, anchored her in the present moment. The puppy's breathing remained shallow and erratic, his tiny body struggling to regulate the warmth that had been stolen from him so suddenly. She could feel his heartbeat, quick, panicked, against her chest, like a constant reminder of the life that was still clinging to the edge of survival. In the truck, she wrapped him in a blanket, making sure to shield him from the cold of the truck's metal interior. His wide eyes stared up at her for a brief moment, his gaze full of confusion, uncertainty, and fear. She spoke softly to him, her voice steady and calm, trying to reassure him, though she had no guarantee that he would understand. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, though she wasn't certain herself. She needed him to know that everything would be all right, that he was no longer alone. She had found him, and she was taking him somewhere safe. She couldn't help but wonder if he even believed her words, or if he could ever believe again, after being abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect him. The drive was slow, the road nearly impassable due to the storm, but the woman focused on the task at hand. The puppy, now lying across the passenger seat, had curled up tightly, as though seeking comfort in his own small space. The woman watched him closely, her eyes flickering between the road ahead and the fragile creature beside her. She could see his chest rising and falling, the shallow breaths that were the only sign of life. She wondered, in that quiet, uncertain space, how long it would take for the puppy to heal. Not just physically, but emotionally. Could he ever trust again? Could she heal the fear that had already taken root deep within him? With every mile that passed, the puppy's body seemed to relax, just a little. His breaths were still faint, but they were slower, more rhythmic. The woman kept glancing at him, unable to stop herself from checking his fragile state. He was so small, so fragile. She could feel the weight of him in her arms, the responsibility of protecting him now resting on her shoulders. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility, a quiet promise made to him that she would not let him suffer again. There was no turning back now. As they finally pulled into her driveway, the snow had begun to slow, the wind dying down just enough to let the world breathe again. The storm had taken everything it could, leaving behind a quiet, peaceful world, though the woman knew that the storm had left its mark on this puppy, just as it had left a mark on her heart. She parked the truck and carefully lifted the puppy in her arms, moving quickly to the door of her house, her mind racing with thoughts of what was next. What did he need? What was she supposed to do? Inside, she set him down on a soft bed, carefully unfurling the blanket that had kept him warm during the drive. The room was filled with soft light, the warmth of the house wrapping around them like a cocoon. The puppy, though still trembling slightly, seemed to relax in the new environment, the soft glow of the room providing a stark contrast to the harsh, biting cold outside. His eyes, once wide and filled with fear, slowly began to soften. But still, there was hesitation, a distance that lingered between them. The puppy wasn't ready to trust yet. He wasn't ready to believe that he was safe. The woman sat by him, her heart heavy with the realization that this was just the beginning. There would be no immediate miracle. Healing, she understood now, was a long, arduous journey. The puppy would need time to heal, and so would she. She could see it in his eyes. He was too scared to truly understand that he was safe. He had been abandoned once, and that kind of pain didn't disappear quickly. She spoke to him softly, her voice steady as she reassured him again. "You're safe now," she whispered, running her fingers gently through his matted fur. She wasn't sure if he believed her. Maybe he wouldn't for a while. But she would show him through her actions, through her patience, that he no longer had to be afraid. She would show him that he could trust again. The night passed slowly, the puppy curled up beside her, still wary but accepting the warmth and safety she provided. The storm outside had finally stopped, and the world seemed to settle into a quiet calm. In the soft glow of the room, the woman watched the puppy sleep, his small body still trembling occasionally, but his breaths coming more easily. As she sat beside him, she felt a quiet hope blooming in her chest. She hadn't just saved this puppy. She had given herself a chance at healing, too. The pain of the storm, the fear, the uncertainty, they were all part of the journey ahead. But in this moment, as the puppy rested beside her, she knew that the first steps toward healing had already begun. The days following the storm were a blur of soft, tender moments, each one a new step in the journey of healing. The puppy, though still uncertain, seemed to find solace in the quiet comfort of the woman's home. Each morning, she would wake to find him curled up in the soft blankets, his small body still frail but no longer shivering from the cold. The warmth of the house surrounded them both, but the woman knew that healing didn't come just from warmth. It came from the space between her words and actions, from the care she gave him without asking for anything in return. The first few days were spent in silence. The puppy didn't bark, didn't whimper, and barely moved. His eyes, though full of fear at first, began to soften. They no longer darted around the room with confusion and panic, but his body still carried the heaviness of trauma, the kind that no amount of food or warmth could undo. He flinched at sudden movements, at loud noises, and when the woman would reach for him too quickly, his body would tense and his eyes would widen. She would pause, then slowly move closer, speaking softly, reassuring him that she wasn't going to hurt him. Her patience was something he had never known, but as the days passed, it was the one thing he seemed to rely on. The woman knew that this puppy had been through something no dog should ever experience. Being abandoned, left to die in a storm. That kind of pain left deep scars. Scars that weren't always visible, but were still there, pressing into the dog's soul. She could feel it in the way he would pull away from her sometimes, or the way he would curl up into himself when she wasn't looking. He didn't trust yet. He couldn't. But the woman was determined to prove to him that he was safe now, that he was home. Every morning she would set aside time to sit with him, to simply be there without expecting anything from him. She would place a hand gently on his back and wait for him to relax. At first, the puppy would stiffen, his body rigid with fear. But as the hours passed, she noticed a subtle change. The tension in his muscles would slowly begin to ease. He wouldn't relax completely, not yet. But there was something there, something small and hopeful. She could see the flicker of curiosity in his eyes as he would watch her, his body shifting ever so slightly towards her, as though testing the waters of trust. The first time he allowed her to touch him without flinching was a moment she would never forget. It was late one afternoon, the golden light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. The puppy had been lying on his side, his eyes half closed, and the woman, sitting just a few feet away, had been watching him. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply let him be. There was no rush, no expectation. She was just there, a presence in the quiet room. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the puppy lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, with questions. The puppy slowly inched forward, his tiny body still unsure, and then, without any warning, he nuzzled her hand gently. She gasped, a rush of emotion flooding her chest, but she didn't move. She let him come to her in his own time. She had learned that trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned, one moment at a time. And in that moment she knew he had taken the first step. He had chosen to let her in. The woman's heart swelled with both pride and tenderness. She gently stroked his fur, the roughness of his matted coat softening under her touch. The puppy leaned into her hand, his body still trembling, but no longer from fear. It was a trembling of something else, a kind of quiet surrender. It was the kind of surrender that came with knowing that he didn't have to fight anymore. He didn't have to face the world alone. She was there, and she would always be there. From that day on, the puppy's healing accelerated. He began to trust her more, to seek her out when he needed comfort, even to curl up beside her when she would sit on the couch. The once feeble creature, who had been abandoned to the cold world, was now becoming something more. His tail wagged, if only just a little, when he saw her, and his eyes, once clouded with fear, were now clearer, filled with something more. Something resembling joy. But even as his body grew stronger, his fear still clung to him, a quiet ghost in the background. The woman saw it in the way his body would stiffen at sudden noises, the way his ears would flatten against his head when someone came to visit. She understood now that his fear didn't just come from being abandoned. It came from the trauma of not knowing if anyone would stay. The puppy had learned to be alone, to fend for himself in a world that didn't care. But here, in the warmth of her home, he was learning something new. He was learning that he didn't have to face the world on his own anymore. Each night, after a day filled with small victories and moments of tenderness, the puppy would sleep soundly beside her, his tiny body curled up against hers. She had begun to leave a small blanket for him to rest on, a place he could call his own, and though he had started to find comfort there, his place beside her on the couch became just as important. The woman would smile softly as she watched him sleep, his breathing steady and calm. He had come so far, from the trembling, scared little thing that had been left to die in the storm, to a puppy who now sought comfort and safety in her presence. Still, the woman knew that healing was a long road. The puppy's body might have been recovering, but his heart and mind were still fragile, still raw from the scars of his past. And so she continued with her quiet care. She didn't rush him, she didn't push him. Every moment of trust, no matter how small, was a victory, and she would wait for him to take his time. She had no expectations, only love. The puppy's healing was slow, but with each new step forward, the woman saw more and more of the dog he could become. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the way he began to wag his tail when she returned home, the way he leaned into her touch without fear. Slowly, the woman was becoming not just his rescuer, but his family, and the puppy, in return, was teaching her the power of patience, of trust, and of love that never gave up. The days had started to blend together in a soft rhythm, one filled with small victories. The puppy, now showing more signs of recovery, had begun to explore the house with a newfound curiosity. His once trembling body, fragile and thin, was now stronger, though still a little unsteady on his feet. His ears perked up at every new sound, his eyes wide with wonder and wariness as he navigated the world around him. Yet, despite the healing, there remained an undercurrent of fear that he couldn't quite shake, an old scar deep within him, one that would not easily fade. The woman had learned to be patient. She had learned that healing wasn't linear. There were days when the puppy would make remarkable progress, his tail wagging in joy as he followed her around the house. Then there were days when his fear would take over, his eyes clouding with confusion and worry, as if the world were once again a dangerous place. She never forced him to do anything he wasn't ready for, but she could see it. The quiet flickers of anxiety still held him in its grasp. It was a cool, crisp afternoon when the real test came. The woman had opened the door to the backyard, hoping to give the puppy a chance to explore beyond the confines of the house. The yard was small but safe, a place where the puppy could begin to learn that the world beyond the door wasn't as frightening as it seemed. She stood by the door, waiting for him to step outside, but the puppy hesitated, his body frozen in place. The air outside was fresh, tinged with the scent of autumn leaves and damp earth, but to the puppy, it felt like another world, one filled with uncertainty. He stood at the threshold, his small body trembling, his eyes wide with doubt. The woman's heart sank. She knew that he was still afraid. There was no rush, no reason to push him, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. She needed him to see that the world was safe, that he didn't have to be afraid anymore. But how could she convince him? How could she show him that this place, her home, was his to explore, to live in? She crouched down in front of him, her voice soft and steady as she spoke to him. "It's okay," she said, offering him a gentle hand. "You can go outside. I'm right here with you." The puppy flinched at her movement, his body instinctively pulling back, as if afraid of what might come next. His tail, once wagging freely, was now tucked between his legs, and his posture was rigid, uncertain. The woman reached out, her hand hovering just above him, waiting. He looked up at her, his eyes searching for reassurance, but there was something else there too, a spark of curiosity, a flicker of courage. It was small, but it was enough to make her heart swell. She could feel it, the slow, steady progress. Taking a deep breath, the woman slowly extended her hand toward him, letting it hover near his chest. "Come on," she whispered. "It's okay. I won't let anything happen to you." The puppy hesitated for a moment, then, with a shaky step, he crossed the threshold. His body was stiff, his legs unsteady, but his gaze remained fixed on the woman, seeking comfort, seeking assurance. The moment his paws touched the grass, his body stiffened. The unfamiliarity of the earth beneath him, the sounds of leaves rustling in the wind, and the open space before him were overwhelming. For a moment, he seemed to freeze, unsure of where to go, unsure of what to do. The woman knelt beside him, her hand gently resting on his back. She didn't rush him. She didn't force him to move. She simply sat with him, waiting, offering her quiet presence. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the only sound being the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a moment of stillness, of uncertainty, but also one of possibility. The puppy's small body trembled slightly, but he was no longer frozen in fear. He was listening to her, feeling her trust and calm energy. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step forward, his paws sinking softly into the grass. The woman smiled, her heart lifting as she watched him move. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, a sign that he was beginning to trust her, to trust that the world outside wasn't as dangerous as he once thought. But just as the puppy began to take a few more steps, a loud, unexpected noise shattered the silence. A car door slammed shut in the distance, its sound sharp and jarring in the quiet afternoon. The puppy immediately froze, his ears flattening against his head, his body tensed, his eyes wide with fear. The woman watched him closely, sensing the panic rising within him. This was it, the test of his courage. The puppy's body began to tremble again, his eyes darting around, searching for the source of the sound. The woman could see the fear creeping back into him, the old trauma rising to the surface. It was too much for him, too overwhelming. She could feel his panic as his small body started to pull away from her. But the woman didn't move. She stayed where she was, calm and steady, her voice soft and soothing as she spoke to him again. "It's okay. I'm here," she said, her voice unwavering. "You're safe. Nothing's going to hurt you." The puppy hesitated, his body trembling with fear, but then, slowly, he turned his gaze back to her. For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the hesitation, the lingering fear. But then, something shifted, just a flicker of courage, a tiny spark that he hadn't known was there. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another, his movements shaky but determined. The woman smiled softly, holding out her hand. With one last deep breath, the puppy crossed the distance between them, his small body trembling but steadying as he reached her. She gently stroked his fur, her touch reassuring him that he was safe. And as he leaned into her, his fear slowly began to melt away. He was no longer alone. He had taken the first step toward trusting the world again, toward facing his fears. For the woman, this moment was everything. She had seen his fear, his uncertainty, his trauma, but she had also seen his courage, his willingness to try again. This was the beginning of his journey, the beginning of his healing, and she would be there every step of the way. The puppy wasn't healed yet, not completely. But this moment, this small victory, was everything. They had taken it together, one step at a time, and it was enough. The days continued to pass in a slow, steady rhythm. The world outside began to change, the colors of autumn deepening as the leaves turned from green to gold, red and brown. But within the confines of the woman's home, the transformation was less obvious, more subtle. The puppy, once a fragile creature trembling from fear, was now beginning to grow in small, unexpected ways. His body was no longer as weak, his ribs less pronounced under his fur, and his gait was steadier with each passing day. But more than that, something deep within him was shifting. His spirit was starting to trust again. It was a slow process, the healing of his heart. The puppy still flinched when someone raised their hand too quickly, still retreated into himself if a door slammed too loudly, and every now and then, his eyes would still hold that deep, haunting fear from his past. But there were moments, brief and fleeting, when the walls around his heart would begin to crack. And those moments were enough. The woman continued to care for him, her patience never wavering. Each morning she would greet him with a soft voice and a gentle hand. She would sit beside him, letting him come to her in his own time, never forcing him to make the first move. The puppy had learned, over the past few weeks, that he could trust her. She wasn't going to hurt him. But trust, she knew, wasn't something that could be rushed. It was something that had to grow, little by little, in its own time. One morning, as the woman sat on the couch, the puppy, now more confident in his movements, padded quietly into the room. She glanced up from her book, her heart lifting at the sight of him. His tail was wagging ever so slightly, his ears up in curiosity. He was no longer cowering in the corner, no longer unsure of her or of himself. He was moving freely, exploring his surroundings with a calm curiosity that hadn't been there before. The woman smiled and set her book aside, her hand reaching out to him, but not in a hurry. She waited, allowing him to make the decision to come to her. He hesitated for a moment, his body still slightly tense, but then he took a small step forward. And then another. He moved closer, his gaze locked onto hers, as though checking in for permission. The woman remained still, giving him the space he needed. Slowly, he leaned into her hand, his fur soft beneath her fingers, and for the first time she felt the full weight of the change in him. His fear was still there, but it was no longer controlling him. The woman stroked his fur gently, a quiet moment of connection passing between them, and she could feel his body begin to relax into the touch. The puppy's breath steadied as he lay beside her, and for a few moments, there was nothing but the sound of their steady breaths and the soft hum of the house around them. The woman didn't try to fill the silence with words. She simply existed in it with him. There was no rush, no agenda. Just the two of them, sharing this small, sacred moment of trust. In the days that followed, the puppy began to seek her out more frequently. He would follow her from room to room, his tail now wagging more freely, his eyes full of an innocent curiosity. He wasn't yet the confident, carefree dog he could become, but he was learning to trust the world around him once again. Every time he would look up at her, there was something more, something that wasn't just fear or uncertainty. It was love, small and fragile, but growing. But even as the puppy made progress, his past continued to cling to him hidden beneath the surface. The world outside, though safe and warm, was still a place that held echoes of pain and fear. One afternoon, the woman opened the door to the backyard once again, this time with no expectation. She had learned to let him go at his own pace, to give him the space he needed. The puppy stood at the threshold, his paws planted firmly on the floor as he sniffed the air. The woman waited, kneeling in front of him. He didn't move at first, his body still. His ears were flicked back, and his eyes darted around the yard as though searching for danger. The air was still, the quiet of the autumn afternoon broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. The puppy's eyes flicked back to the woman, and she could see it in his gaze. A brief flicker of uncertainty, of doubt. There was a world outside of this home, a world that had once been cruel to him. He didn't know what to expect out there. He didn't know if he could trust it. The woman reached out, her hand gently resting on his back, and she spoke softly, as she always did. "It's okay, little one. You don't have to go if you don't want to." She gave him a moment, watching as his body seemed to relax just a little. His tail moved cautiously, a subtle sign of the trust he was building. Slowly, he stepped forward, his paws making soft impressions in the grass. He took one hesitant step, then another, his body still tense but no longer frozen in fear. The woman smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride and tenderness. It wasn't a leap into complete freedom, but it was a step. One small step. She knew the path ahead would still be full of challenges. There would be moments of fear, moments when he would retreat, but this was progress. This was growth. And each step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. For the next few weeks, the puppy would venture out into the backyard with her, exploring the grass, sniffing the air, feeling the sun on his back. There were still moments when his body would stiffen at unfamiliar sounds, when his tail would tuck between his legs. But every day the woman could see it. The walls he had built around his heart slowly crumbling. He was learning to trust again, not just in her, but in the world around him. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, the puppy's head resting on her lap, the woman realized just how far they had come. The small, trembling creature she had found in the snow was no longer the same dog. He was stronger now, not just in body, but in spirit. He was beginning to believe in love again, in safety, in the possibility of a future. And though there were still battles to be fought, she knew that together, they would face them, one step at a time. The puppy had grown stronger over the weeks, his small frame filling out as his once shaky legs became more sure. Each step more confident than the last. His fur, though still soft, had begun to shine again under the gentle touch of the woman who had saved him. His body was no longer a fragile shell of what it once was. He was a living, breathing being with a future, one full of promise. But there was something deeper, something less visible, that the woman could still see in the way he moved, the way his eyes darted toward the door when it opened or when a loud noise pierced the air. It was the remnants of his past, the fear that had been etched into him before he had found her. She had hoped that, with time, the fear would fade, replaced by the security of love, warmth, and safety. But she soon learned that trust, once shattered, doesn't heal quickly. Every new sound in the house, every unfamiliar face, every unexpected shift in the world outside would send a ripple of panic through his body. And no matter how much she reassured him, no matter how much patience she gave him, the scars of his past lingered like silent ghosts, waiting to resurface when least expected. One morning, the woman decided to take him on a short walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp with the bite of autumn, and the leaves crunched beneath her boots as they stepped outside. The puppy was hesitant at first, his eyes flicking nervously toward the unfamiliar world beyond the safety of the house. The woman knelt down beside him, gently coaxing him forward with a soft voice. "It's okay," she murmured, offering him her hand. He looked at her, still uncertain, but after a moment, he stepped forward. His steps were tentative, unsure, but he followed her, his head held low, his eyes scanning every corner of their surroundings. The walk was quiet at first, the world around them filled with the rustling of fallen leaves and the distant hum of passing cars. The puppy trotted beside her, his pace slow, his body stiff, but he was moving. For a moment the woman allowed herself to smile. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He was no longer cowering in the corner. He was taking the first steps into the world, trusting her, trusting the safety she provided. But as they turned a corner, a loud noise suddenly shattered the stillness. A dog barked from a nearby yard, its voice sharp and sudden, echoing through the air. The puppy froze. His body went rigid, his ears flattened against his head, and his eyes widened with panic. His tail tucked between his legs, and he took a step backward, his entire body trembling. The woman's heart clenched as she saw the fear return in full force. This was it, the test. She knelt down beside him, speaking softly, her voice gentle yet firm. "It's okay, I'm here. You're safe," she whispered, but the puppy didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the source of the sound, his body coiled in terror, as if waiting for something bad to happen. The bark continued in the distance, and the world around them suddenly felt too big, too overwhelming. The puppy's breathing became erratic, shallow gasps escaping his chest. His body shook, and for a moment it seemed like he might run, might flee into the safety of the unknown, where he could escape the fear that threatened to consume him. The woman could feel his fear, his panic, in the way his muscles tensed beneath her fingertips. She knew what this moment meant. She knew that he needed to make a choice to remain in the safety of her presence, to trust her or to succumb to the fear that had once held him captive. But she also knew that forcing him wasn't the answer. She couldn't rush him. He had to make the decision himself in his own time. Slowly she reached out and placed a hand gently on his back, just as she had done so many times before. The puppy flinched, his body stiffening, but he didn't pull away. His eyes were still wide with fear, his breathing shallow and uneven, but he remained rooted in place. The woman didn't speak. She just let her touch reassure him. She didn't ask him to face his fear all at once. She just wanted him to feel her presence, to know that she wouldn't let him face this alone. Minutes passed in silence, the world continuing to spin around them. The puppy's body remained tense, but gradually, very slowly, he began to relax. His breathing steadied, the frantic gasp slowing to something more controlled. His eyes, still filled with fear, shifted from the sound of the barking dog to the woman beside him. And in that moment, she saw it. The faintest glimmer of trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He wasn't running. He wasn't trying to escape. He was choosing to stay. The woman smiled softly, her hand still resting on his back, her voice a soft murmur. "You're okay. I'm here." She continued to stroke him gently, allowing him to feel her calm, her steady presence. Slowly, after what felt like an eternity, the puppy took a tentative step forward. His eyes never left the woman, his body still trembling, but he moved, putting one paw in front of the other. The barking dog had faded into the distance, and the world had grown just a little quieter. For the puppy, this moment was everything. He had faced the fear, and though it hadn't disappeared, he had not let it control him. The woman stood up, her hand still on his back, guiding him as they continued their walk. The puppy's steps were slower now, more cautious, but he was walking with her, trusting her to guide him through the world. The fear was still there, buried deep inside, but it no longer had a hold on him. He was learning that he didn't have to be alone in his fear, that there was strength in trusting someone else, in choosing not to run. The woman could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet triumph of it. She knew that there would be more tests ahead, more moments of fear, more challenges to face. But in that moment, as she walked beside him, she knew that they had taken a step together. A step toward healing, toward trust, toward a future where the puppy could finally be free of the fear that had once consumed him. The rest of the walk passed in peaceful silence. The puppy's steps grew steadier, more confident with each passing moment. And though the world around them was still full of unfamiliar sounds and sights, he was no longer afraid of them. He had taken that first step, and though it was small, it was everything. It was the beginning of something beautiful, something the woman had known all along. Healing wasn't easy, but it was possible, one step at a time. The days grew longer, the crisp air of autumn slowly giving way to the chill of winter. But within the warmth of the woman's home, there was a quiet transformation taking place. The puppy, now more than just a shivering, fragile soul, had begun to flourish. Each morning he greeted her with a wag of his tail, a sign of the quiet trust that was growing between them. His eyes, once full of fear, now held the spark of curiosity, the wide, untrusting gaze replaced by a soft glow of affection. Though he still had moments of hesitation, moments when his body would stiffen at an unfamiliar sound or a sudden movement, he was no longer the same scared creature who had first been cradled in her arms. He was becoming his own dog, a dog who trusted, who loved, who was learning what it meant to be free of fear. The woman watched him carefully, sensing that every small action was another piece of his healing. She had been patient, giving him the space to come to her when he was ready, letting him take the time he needed. She had known from the beginning that trust wasn't something that could be forced. It had to be earned step by step. And now, she was beginning to see the fruits of that patience. But trust, like healing, wasn't linear. There were still moments when the past would catch up with him, when the shadows of abandonment would resurface. One such moment came on a particularly quiet afternoon. The puppy had been napping, his body curled into a small, warm ball on the couch, the soft sound of his breathing filling the room. The woman, lost in a book, had not noticed the quiet footsteps approaching the door. It was only when the doorbell rang sharp and unexpected that the puppy's world suddenly shattered. His body tensed immediately, his muscles going rigid, his ears flattened against his head, and his eyes widened with fear. The ringing of the doorbell, the sound so common to the woman, was a noise that the puppy had never fully learned to accept. In that instant, it wasn't just a doorbell. It was a reminder of a time when every unexpected sound meant danger, when every sharp noise was a signal that the world was not safe, not kind. The woman looked up, noticing the change in him immediately. His body had stiffened, his legs locked in place. She could see the panic in his eyes, the flash of terror that he hadn't fully let go of. Her heart sank, but she didn't move toward him. She didn't rush to reassure him with words or touch. Instead, she stood still, her gaze steady as she watched him navigate the fear that was trying to take over. "Hey, it's okay," she said softly, her voice low and comforting, a constant thread of calm in the midst of the puppy's rising panic. "It's just the doorbell, buddy. Nothing to be afraid of." But the puppy didn't respond, didn't move. His eyes were locked onto the door, his body trembling with the weight of the old fear. The woman knew what she had to do, but she knew also that this wasn't a moment that could be rushed. She had to give him time. She had to show him that the world had changed, that this moment was different from every other noise he had feared in the past. Slowly, she moved toward him, her footsteps gentle on the wooden floor. She didn't rush to touch him, didn't force herself into his space. Instead, she knelt beside him, her hand hovering just above his back, letting him feel her presence without pushing him into anything he wasn't ready for. She could see the tremble in his body, the fear that was still so raw. The woman took a deep breath and let her hand fall gently onto his back. At first, the puppy flinched, his body tensed again, his legs ready to flee. But as her hand stayed firm and steady, as she continued to speak softly to him, his body slowly began to relax, if only a little. His eyes flicked between the door and her hand, the battle between his fear and his trust playing out in real time. She waited. The moment stretched on, but she remained patient. She didn't move, didn't try to take away the fear. She just allowed him to feel her calm presence. The doorbell rang again. This time softer, less jarring than before. The puppy's body went tense again, but this time he didn't retreat. Slowly, ever so slowly, his eyes shifted back to the woman. She could see the fear in his gaze. But there was something else there now, too. The woman kept her hand on his back, her touch a constant reassurance, letting him feel her steadiness, her unwavering support. The puppy blinked, and for a moment, his breath steadied. He was still trembling, still uncertain. But he wasn't panicking. He was standing his ground, learning to face the fear that had once controlled him. It was then that he did something remarkable. He took a single step forward, away from the door, toward her. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the first time he had actively chosen to move through the fear, to face it, instead of letting it take over. The woman's heart swelled with quiet pride. This small step was a victory, not just for the puppy, but for them both. The moment didn't last long. The puppy moved back into the safety of her lap, his body still trembling, but his eyes, once filled with terror, now looked at her with a glimmer of trust. The doorbell no longer felt like a threat. He had faced it and survived. The fear hadn't disappeared, but he had learned that he could face it, and he could trust her to be there, guiding him through it. The woman hugged him gently, her voice soft as she whispered, "You're safe now. You're okay." She knew, in that moment, that this was what he needed. He needed the space to process, to feel the fear and face it on his own terms. She didn't try to take it away from him, didn't try to make it vanish. She simply held space for him, letting him take his time, letting him learn that fear didn't have to control him. And that, in itself, was a gift. The doorbell rang again. This time, the puppy didn't flinch. His body was still, his eyes slightly narrowed, but there was no fear in them. His body was still tense, but he was no longer afraid. He was learning to trust, to stand his ground. And with each new experience, with each small victory, he was growing stronger, braver. The woman smiled softly, feeling the shift within both of them. It wasn't just the puppy who had healed, she had healed too. She had learned the power of patience, of giving love without expecting anything in return. She had learned to trust in the process, to trust in their journey together. And as the doorbell rang again, it felt less like a threat and more like a challenge they could face together, one step at a time. The weeks passed slowly, each one blending into the next with small, quiet moments that marked the puppy's gradual transformation. What had once been a scared, trembling creature who could barely lift his head from the ground was now beginning to show signs of life. of joy, of curiosity, of a future that was no longer defined by fear. The woman watched him closely, her heart swelling with each new sign of progress. His fur had grown back thick and soft, and his once skeletal frame now held a healthy weight. But beyond that, there was something in his eyes that told a different story, a story of trust, of learning to love again. He no longer flinched at every noise, nor did he cower when the woman moved too quickly. The puppy was beginning to find his place in the world, and so was she. Every day, he would walk a little further into the backyard, his paws tentatively making their way across the grass. He sniffed the air, his tail wagging ever so slightly, his body still cautious but no longer rigid with fear. The world outside the house was still large and unfamiliar, but it was no longer something to be feared. The woman would sit beside him, her presence a steady reassurance as he explored the space around him. Each new step was a victory, no matter how small. He was no longer just surviving, he was beginning to live. But even as he grew stronger, the echoes of his past were never far behind. There were moments, brief flashes, when the fear would return, when his body would tense, when his eyes would look off into the distance with uncertainty. The woman knew that healing wasn't something that happened overnight, that the scars of his abandonment would take time to fade. But every day, the puppy made progress. Every day, he learned a little more about what it meant to be safe, to be loved, to be free. One afternoon, as the woman sat on the back porch, the puppy trotted up to her, his body lighter, more confident than ever before. He circled around her, wagging his tail, his eyes gleaming with excitement. The woman smiled, leaning down to pet him. She noticed that his body no longer flinched at her touch. He leaned into her hand, nuzzling it with a softness that made her heart swell. He was no longer the broken puppy who had been left to die in the storm. He was a dog who had learned to trust, to be loved, to be free. It was then that the woman made a decision. She knew that, in order for him to truly heal, he had to experience the world on his own terms. He had to be free to roam, to explore, and to find joy without fear. She opened the back gate to the yard and watched as the puppy took his first real steps into the world beyond the fence. His tail wagged, his paws light against the earth, and for the first time in his life he was truly free. The woman stood at the edge of the yard, watching him move toward the open field. He hesitated at first, looking back at her as if seeking reassurance. She smiled softly, her heart in her throat, but she didn't call him back. She let him make the choice. Slowly, the puppy stepped forward, his movements hesitant but sure. He was exploring, finding his way, and for the first time, the woman didn't feel the need to guide him. She knew he was ready for this, ready for the world that awaited him. The puppy explored the grass, running in small circles, sniffing the air, feeling the earth beneath his paws. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when his body would tense, when the sound of a passing car or a bird overhead would make him stop and look around. But each time that happened, the woman could see it, the faintest flicker of his old fear, but also the realization that he was okay, that he was safe. The world wasn't the same as it had been when he had been abandoned, and with each new step he was learning that he had a place in it. The woman watched from the porch, her heart heavy but filled with hope. She knew that this moment wasn't the end of his journey. It was only the beginning. There would be setbacks. There would be moments when the past would try to claim him again. But for now, for this moment, the puppy was free. And that was enough. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, the puppy finally ran back to her, his body light and his tail wagging furiously. He stopped in front of her, panting lightly, and looked up at her with eyes that were no longer filled with fear but with something else. Something soft, something warm. He nuzzled her leg, and she reached down to pet him, her heart full. In that moment she knew that this was what healing looked like, not just a body restored, but a soul reborn. The puppy had come so far, and so had she. Later that evening, as the puppy lay beside her on the couch, his head resting on her lap, the woman thought about the journey they had been on. The road had been long, and there were still miles ahead of them, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of peace. The puppy was no longer the frightened, abandoned creature he had once been. He was a dog, her dog, and together they had found something beautiful, something worth holding on to. She stroked his fur gently, her thoughts wandering to the future, to the adventures they would have, to the life they would build together. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, but she knew this much: they would face them together, side by side. And in that moment, as the puppy slept peacefully beside her, she knew that love and trust had the power to heal even the deepest of wounds. The days had become easier, quieter, full of soft routine. The puppy, now named Max by the woman, had settled into her life in a way she hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just her companion anymore. He was a part of her world, an integral piece that made everything feel fuller, more alive. He was a dog who had learned to trust, not just in her but in himself. There was a lightness in his step now, a joy that had once been absent, and the woman could see it every time he ran toward her, tail wagging, eyes full of affection. He had become her shadow, following her from room to room, his paws padding softly on the floor behind her. He was always there, by her side, a constant presence that had filled a space in her heart she hadn't known was empty. She had started to take him on longer walks around the neighborhood, watching him as he explored with a newfound confidence. He no longer hesitated when a car passed by or when another dog barked in the distance. He moved forward, eyes bright with curiosity, eager to take on the world. It was as though the past had begun to slip away, piece by piece, and in its place there was something more, something hopeful. But the journey hadn't been without its setbacks. Even now there were moments when Max's fear would rise up unexpected and powerful. He would stiffen at a sudden noise, or freeze in place if a stranger came too close. The old scars, those deep marks left by his abandonment, were not easily erased. They would show up when he was least expecting it, and the woman had learned to be patient, to give him the time he needed to regain his composure. She had learned that healing wasn't just about physical recovery. It was about learning to let go of the past, piece by piece, and trusting that the future could be different. One evening, after a long day of errands, the woman came home to find Max waiting by the door, his tail wagging in anticipation. She smiled, the warmth in her chest swelling as she opened the door and stepped inside. He had become a familiar presence. His joy at seeing her after even the shortest absence a reminder of how far they had both come. She set down her bags and bent down to greet him, her hands resting on his back as she scratched behind his ears. He leaned into her touch, his body relaxed, his eyes soft. But even in the calm of this moment, she could see it. The slight tension in his shoulders, the way his body would freeze when he heard a noise outside. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't whole. But he was trying. He was learning, and so was she. That evening, as they sat on the couch together, Max curled up next to her with his head on her lap. The woman thought about how much had changed. She had never expected to find herself here, in this quiet, peaceful home, with a dog who had once been abandoned in the snow, afraid of the world. She hadn't expected to love him this much, to feel so deeply connected to him. But here they were, two beings who had found each other at the most unlikely moment, bound together by a journey neither of them could have predicted. Max's breathing was steady as he slept, his small body warm against her. She stroked his fur gently, feeling the rise and fall of his chest beneath her fingers. The quiet of the room, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fire, felt like a moment suspended in time. It was perfect, in its own way, a perfect reflection of how far they had come together. But the world outside, she knew, was still a big place. And Max wasn't ready to face it on his own, not yet. He still needed her patience and her love. And she would give him that. She would give him everything. She had promised herself that, and she had promised him that too. The next morning, she decided to take him to the park. It was a place they hadn't ventured together yet. A larger, more open space that felt like a challenge for Max, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. The woman wasn't sure either, but she felt that it was time to let him experience the world, time to see how far he had come. She prepared for the trip carefully, making sure to pack everything they might need: water, a blanket, treats. And as she clipped the leash onto his collar, she noticed the slight hesitation in his eyes. His body was tense, his ears flicking back and forth. He was unsure, and that was okay. She could feel the fear in him, the old memories, but she also felt the spark of something new, the beginnings of courage. They arrived at the park just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the wide open space. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp leaves and fresh grass. Max stood at the entrance, his body stiff, eyes scanning the surroundings. The park was nearly empty, save for a few joggers and their dogs in the distance. It was a place that should have felt safe, yet to Max, It was a world of unknowns, a world where anything could happen. The woman bent down to his level, her voice gentle but firm. "It's okay," she said. "You're not alone. I'm right here with you." Max's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, she saw it. The flicker of trust, the quiet understanding that he wasn't in this alone. With a deep breath, Max took a step forward and then another. His paws sank into the grass as he moved with careful, cautious steps, his eyes still searching, still uncertain, but no longer frozen by fear. The woman walked beside him, her hand resting gently on his back as they made their way down the path. Max's tail was still low, his body tensed. But he was moving, choosing to face the world instead of retreating from it. They passed by the other dogs, some of them barking playfully, but Max didn't flinch. He looked at them, his eyes focused but calm. He was no longer consumed by the world around him. He was walking through it, moving with it, and that was enough. By the time they reached the edge of the park, the sky was painted in shades of pink and orange. Max had walked through the entire space, stopping every now and then to sniff the ground, to take in the new smells, the new sights. The woman smiled softly as she watched him, her heart full of pride. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't healed completely. But he was learning step by step that the world wasn't so big and scary after all. He was learning to trust again, and in that process, she was learning too. Learning that love, patience, and time could heal even the deepest wounds. As they made their way back to the car, Max trotted happily beside her, his body light, his steps confident. The woman looked down at him, her heart full, and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." And in that moment, she knew that the world was a big place, full of challenges and uncertainties, but it was a world they could face together, one step at a time. It was a cold winter morning when Max first slowed down. The woman had noticed the subtle changes in him over the past few weeks, his once sprightly steps growing slower, his energy more subdued. His once glossy coat had lost some of its luster, his body more tired than it had been in the past. She had tried not to worry at first. He was getting older, after all. But there was something in his eyes that made her heart ache. A sadness, perhaps, or a resignation that she hadn't seen before. She had always known that this day would come, though she had never been prepared for it. The thought of saying goodbye to Max, the dog who had been her companion, her heart, and her healer, felt impossible to grasp. He had been through so much, and she had been right there with him. His protector, his guide, his source of comfort. He had transformed from the trembling puppy in the snow to a dog who ran joyfully in the park, who loved life again. But now, as the snow began to fall heavier outside, the woman saw the signs of aging in him. His legs were stiffer, his once sharp gaze more cloudy, and he spent more time resting, unable to keep up with the same energy he once had. The morning had begun like any other. Max had eaten his breakfast, though he did so more slowly than usual. He hadn't jumped up to greet her at the door like he used to. Instead, he lay in his favorite spot by the window, his eyes half closed as he watched the snow fall gently outside. His breathing was slower than usual, and his body felt heavier when she gently rubbed his back. She could tell that he was tired, more so than before, but there was still something in his eyes. Something that held on to life, something that told her he wasn't ready to give up just yet. The woman sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his head. "You've been so brave, Max," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've come so far. I'm so proud of you." Max's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, and he lifted his head slightly to nuzzle her hand, his body sluggish but still capable of showing affection. His tail thumped weakly against the floor. It was small, but it was enough. She smiled through the tears that threatened to spill, knowing how much he had overcome in his life. He had been rescued, healed, and loved. They had both healed together, in ways they hadn't expected. For a long while, they sat together in silence, the only sounds the soft ticking of the clock and the quiet whispers of the wind outside. The snow continued to fall, soft and gentle, a blanket of white that seemed to calm the world, just as Max had calmed her life in ways she never thought possible. But the reality that had been looming over them both for so long finally began to settle in. Max was no longer the young, energetic puppy he once was. His body was aging, his strength fading, and with that, the woman knew that the time was coming. She had feared this day, the day when the end would come, but she had also known that it was inevitable. Life was fleeting, and she had spent every moment with Max cherishing the time they had together. Later that afternoon, as the light outside began to dim, the woman decided it was time. She carefully picked Max up, her arms gentle but firm, and carried him to the car. He had been slow, his legs struggling to carry him through the house, but he had still managed to get up on his own. He hadn't resisted, he knew something was happening, but he trusted her. They had been through so much together that there were no more words left. Their bond had been built over time, piece by piece, trust earned through actions rather than promises. Max had become her family, her companion, and now, as they faced the inevitable, she would be there for him as she always had been. The drive to the vet was quiet, the world outside white and still. The woman couldn't help but glance over at Max, who was resting his head in her lap, his breathing slow and steady. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She wasn't ready to let go, but she knew it was time. Max had lived a good life. He had known love, safety, and happiness. He had given so much to her, taught her more than she could ever repay. And now it was her turn to give him peace. When they arrived at the vet's office, the woman didn't have to say a word. The look in her eyes spoke volumes, and the vet, a kind and understanding woman, immediately led them to a quiet room. The atmosphere was soft, peaceful, designed to offer comfort in moments like this. Max lay on the table, his head resting in the woman's lap, his body relaxed but still. She gently stroked his fur as the vet prepared, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Max," she said softly, tears running down her cheeks. "You were everything to me. You saved me, too." The vet gave them the time they needed. The woman held Max, her heart breaking with every passing second. His breathing slowed, his eyes growing heavy. She whispered to him, her hand never leaving his back. "You're not alone. I love you so much. I always will." And then, in that quiet room, surrounded by the soft sounds of the world outside, Max took his final breath. He let go peacefully, the weight of his body no longer a burden. The woman held him close, her tears mingling with the soft fur of his head. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she knew it was the right thing. She had given him a life filled with love, and now she was letting him go, knowing that he was at peace. As the woman left the vet's office with Max's collar in her hand, a sense of calm washed over her. She had loved him so deeply, and in return, he had given her a kind of love she had never known before. Max had saved her in ways she couldn't fully explain, and she would carry the memory of him with her always. The snow continued to fall as she made her way back home. She could feel Max's spirit with her, a presence that was no longer confined to the body of the dog she had rescued. He had been a part of her life, and his love would never fade. The pain of his loss was real, but the woman knew that the love they had shared would last forever. And as she stood in the doorway, looking out at the world that had once been too big for Max to face, she whispered softly into the wind, "Thank you, Max. I'll carry you with me, always." The winter's chill had settled deep into the bones of the world, making each breath feel like a delicate shard of ice piercing the air. The days had become shorter, the sun's light feeble against the ever-gray sky. Yet, despite the deepening cold inside the woman's home, there was warmth, both in the flickering fireplace and in the quiet moments she spent with Max. She had never imagined, when she first found him trembling in the snow, that they would grow into this steady rhythm of life together. She never imagined that the love they shared would become as much a part of her as her own breath, filling every corner of her heart. But time, in its cruel way, doesn't wait for anyone, and neither did the years. Max had always been there by her side. When she woke in the morning, his tail would wag slowly in greeting, his body eager to start the day. When she came home after errands, he would greet her at the door, his joyful barks ringing through the house, as if he had been waiting for her to come back for eternity. His presence had become a constant, a source of comfort, of joy. He had become her family, her companion, the embodiment of unconditional love and quiet loyalty. He had taught her what it meant to trust again, to open her heart to something, or someone, who could make you believe in the beauty of second chances. But now, as the soft hum of the winter wind rustled against the windows, something had changed. Max, once so energetic, so full of life, was slowing down. His steps, once quick and sure, had become labored and slower. His coat, once thick and shining, had become thinner, its luster dulled by age and time. And his eyes, once sharp and alert, now carried a softness to them, a gentle wariness that spoke of a life well lived, but one that was beginning to fade. One afternoon, as the woman was getting ready to leave for the grocery store, she noticed something in the way Max was lying on the rug by the window. His body, once so nimble and full of energy, was now stiff, his breathing shallow and labored. He hadn't moved from his spot for hours, only lifting his head slightly when she walked by, but his eyes were distant. The woman bent down beside him, her fingers brushing through his fur. She could feel the faint tremble in his body, the quiet exhaustion that seemed to settle into his bones. She had known this day would come. She had known that, like all things, Max's time in this world was finite. But even knowing that one day she would have to say goodbye, nothing had prepared her for the weight of this moment. The woman sat beside him, her heart heavy with a sadness she had never expected to feel. She had lost people before, but never in the same way. Max wasn't just a dog, he had been her savior, her companion, the one who had pulled her out of the darkness when she had thought there was no way forward. Max, sensing the change in the air, lifted his head weakly and looked at her. His eyes, though clouded with age, still held the same love, the same trust that he had given her from the very beginning. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, her tears slipping silently into his fur. She whispered to him, her voice thick with emotion, "You've been my best friend, Max. You've taught me so much. You've given me everything, and now, I'll give you everything." It felt like the world around them held its breath. The quiet ticking of the clock, the soft hum of the heater, the gentle rustling of the trees outside, all faded into the background. The only sound that mattered was the rhythm of Max's labored breathing, the pulse of his heart beneath her hand. She stroked him gently, whispering words of love, of gratitude, of promise. She could feel the weight of time pressing down on both of them. The hours, the days, the years they had shared. Together, they had made something beautiful. The woman couldn't bear the thought of losing him, but she also knew that love meant letting go. Max had been through so much in his life. He had been abandoned, left in the snow to die, and yet he had chosen to trust again, to love again. He had spent every moment of his time with her, offering her his loyalty, his heart, and his unwavering love. And now it was her turn to give him peace. She had made the decision long ago. Though it hurt more than anything she had ever felt in her life, it was time. The woman carefully lifted Max into her arms, cradling him as she had done so many times before. She didn't hurry, didn't rush. There was no need. She would take him to the vet, where the kind woman who had helped them before would help him find peace, would help him slip away from the pain he had carried for so long. But she would be there with him every step of the way. She would hold him, as she always had, until the very end. The car ride was quiet, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence. Max, resting in her lap, had grown so still. His head rested against her, and though he had always loved the warmth of her touch, now there was a gentle acceptance in his posture. He wasn't afraid, he was ready. When they arrived at the vet's office, the woman was met with a look of understanding. The vet, a kind woman with soft hands and a gentle demeanor, led them into a quiet room, one where the light was soft, the air still. There were no words needed. The woman just held Max, her tears mingling with his fur as she stroked his head. She whispered, "You were everything to me, Max. You will always be in my heart." The vet, with a quiet grace, prepared the room, and the woman, though her heart was breaking, knew that this was the most loving thing she could do for Max. She held him as his breathing slowed, as the pain finally left his body. Max, the puppy who had been abandoned in the snow, had finally found peace. His eyes closed one last time, his body relaxed in the woman's arms, and for the first time in a long while, the weight of the world seemed to lift. The woman left the vet's office, a sense of calm settling over her as she carried Max's collar in her hand. The house would feel empty now, silent without the sound of his paws padding across the floor, the absence of his joyful barks filling the air. But as she stood in the doorway, looking out at the snow that had once been a symbol of his suffering, she knew that Max's spirit would never leave her. He had been the light in her life, and though he was no longer by her side, his love would live on forever. She whispered into the wind, "Thank you, Max. I'll carry you with me, always." And as she walked back into the quiet house, she knew that love, even in its absence, could transcend time. The bond they had shared would live on, timeless and eternal.